Hello and welcome to our series, Delivering the Tech That Delivers for Government, sponsored by Future Tech Enterprise on Federal News Network. I'm Vanessa Roberts, and today I'm talking with Mike Watkinson. He's the Chief Revenue Officer at Future Tech. We're going to dig into digital maturity, how to define it, what it looks like in practice, and where federal systems integrators are in achieving it. Welcome, Mike. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic today, and I really want to just start off kind of level set. Maybe from your perspective, just define what digital maturity means and how you think about that at Future Tech.
Yeah, sure. So when we talk to customers about digital maturity, it's a lot about people and process and technology. Today, more and more, it's also talking about data and data management.
Right.
But I think it's ultimately a customer's ability to leverage their digital assets and be more agile, be more innovative.
Right.
The maturity aspect of that is how far along they are in that trajectory and that curve.
Right.
But most of them want to go faster. And so we'll talk to them about technical debt. We'll talk to them about different types of relationships that they can foster to get to that to that end.
To what it means to them.
Yeah.
And clearly that's a big topic right now for federal systems integrators in this environment where that emphasis is really renewed on how effective you are, how efficient you are.
Yeah.
Maybe talk about from the customers who you have been working with, where you see FSIs are along that maturity path, and then kind of what they're talking to you about. What are they asking you? Some of the questions you kind of alluded to in your first answer.
Yeah. So FSIs are large Global 100 customers, right? Essentially, and so over time, inorganic growth and acquisitions create a lot of the traditional complexities around those people and process and technologies, right? And so they struggle with platforms that are redundant through those acquisitions. I've got multiple ERPs, I've got multiple PLMs, and all kinds of interdependencies that aren't really that well understood between the technologies and the people in the process. And so you end up with this technical debt over time that is really hard to overcome. And we found that becomes a digital maturity journey, not any one event. And it also requires a different type of relationship with your partners. The data side of it is sort of a newer challenge. The data side is more about how do you unlock the value of data across an enterprise? And FSIs are generally challenged with operating in completely separate P&Ls or separate programs and sectors and business units. So. So generally those are the things that we're talking about in terms of maturity.
So let's look at it a little bit closer and talk about something you mentioned right away, which is they want to do it faster. Yeah. How do they want to evolve, and what does that look like? Maybe talk about that journey and path a little bit. And then what are those challenges? What are the specific ones? You mentioned, obviously, debt and legacy systems. It's a huge one. It's the same one that a lot of agencies have, and those are the people that the FSIs are serving. Yeah. So let's kind of talk about that and how they could be overcome.
Well, especially in today's climate, it's this challenge, it's this balance, I guess, of like cost savings and innovation. And how do you do both? Bob Venero, our president and CEO, was on previously and talked about addressing technical debt and cost savings from a PC life cycle perspective. And the inclination is to immediately say, okay, well, let's extend the refresh cycle. Let's limit the specifications and capabilities of an asset and save some cost there. But actually the inverse is true in terms of what happens. You lose productivity and you increase costs. What we should be doing is adhering to a refresh cycle. We should be increasing capabilities of the asset. We should be looking at standards of configuration and so forth. How do we foster innovation at the edge? How do we look at, during the refresh cycle, redeploying some of those assets? So all opportunities from a more programmatic long-term perspective than just looking at the particular asset and trying to save money there. And we think that the same is true from a data center perspective. If you look at any particular asset refresh and think modernize the asset or something to that effect, it's got to be more programmatic in a journey than that. And there's a couple of elements and sort of milestones that we look for along the way as opportunities to create that journey. But first and foremost, it's about a relationship with your ecosystem partners, where you can go from sort of transactional single asset mindsets to a more transformational approach. So those are the sort of starting points for the conversations.
Right. You mentioned one thing, you said global. All right, so that's a huge piece of this because they are global, a lot of these organizations, and they're serving federal organizations that are sometimes global, but generally at least nationwide.
Yeah.
Talk about that unusual challenge and kind of where that fits into that digital maturity piece and how you talk to customers about that.
Many of our FSI customers and even our Global 100 commercial customers are sort of, they've got domestic standards, domestic US standards, but they've also got international interests. And rather than treat those separately, we want to create more consistency and predictability across standards globally. How do we get predictable price books, and how do we look at and leverage volumes across all of that business? But at the same time, the concern is over security and who are the people that are servicing those assets, right? Domestically, we can control those. Internationally, we have a little bit less control. From Future Tech standpoint, we've been growing our international business to gain more control over the configuration management and the services that we provide internationally. But I think ultimately our customers are looking for more consistency, more predictability, and fewer vendors to work with them.
It's a huge piece of this visibility and having that visibility so that you can actually understand where the differences are and address that legacy, that debt legacy, because that's one of the key challenges, right? How do you find it and know it and address it?
Yeah, it's I think that technical debt is, again, it's got to be more of a systematic approach and more of a journey. So what we look for is pockets of innovation that are creating new standards. And we really try to foster that innovation, but also sort of connect the dots between all of what's happening. And so what I mean by that is if innovations are becoming more standards and pockets around the organization, we try to connect those dots and we look for what's common and repeatable and scalable. And in doing that, you sort of get more people agreeing that they're not as unique as they thought they were, right? So you think of FSIs and programs as being, I've got custom requirements, I'm different. But foundationally, they're birthright services, they're RMF controls, even if there are different classified networks, they're all fairly similar. At least 80% of them are similar, right? And common and repeatable. And so we look for those standards that are potentially common architectures, and we really try to build on those as sort of that next generation of where we're going, and foster that. A good example is with AI. So, shadow IT was one thing, shadow AI is another. And so we actually created the first NVIDIA ELA for one of our customers. And the effect of that was that all of the shadow AI that was happening rose to the surface. It's like the iceberg flipped on its head, right? But people came out of the woodwork and said, I want access to that. How can I get that discount? How can I get that license? And so an ELA like that, a bigger, longer term agreement, has the opportunity to find what's becoming more common and repeatable and scalable, drive that innovation, and sort of start to change the standard versus what the technical debt used to look like.
Is there a culture issue that has to be overcome sometimes? Because you mentioned, like, I'm unique, I'm different, I'm not really the same, but yet in the technology realm, some of the needs were the same. But so what's the cultural challenge there?
Yeah, so programs lack a real demand forecast generally for the rest of the enterprise. They lack an ability to commit longer term to certain agreements across the enterprise. And so culturally, the organization really needs to lean into how they aggregate more spend, create more leverage, create a transformational relationship with the right strategic partners. And that's really the shift that opens up sort of more transparency to what the spend is in those different pockets. And once we have that sort of transparency, now we can start to identify what the savings really look like. So culturally within FSIs, it's about breaking down some of those barriers. How do you define indirect spend versus direct spend, right? How do you operationalize chargeback across the organization? That's a big one, right? Really hard to do from a P&L perspective, but we've figured out ways to charge back, do drawdowns against license agreements and so forth, and really help them operationalize those types of agreements.
And that's a huge piece too, because that's a lot of the time where they directly interact with the government. Right?
Yeah.
And that licensing piece can be super expensive if you don't manage it.
Yes.
And
yeah.
if there's anything shadow, to your point, which
yeah.
in technical debt, there often is things that suddenly appear.
Yeah. I mean, but ultimately technical debt, going back to that, is about, it's underutilized assets, it's huge maintenance burdens, it's major license renewals, right? And so addressing all of that as part of this conversation is something that, again, helps accelerate the move from the technical debt sort of to those new standards, and new agreements are a big way to capture it.
Right. And allows the innovation.
And innovation. And I think there's major milestones in spend that we look for with our customers that say, make it more concurrent, try to aggregate that spend more. Instead of treating that as a transactional procurement, let's make it more concurrent with others. Let's look at those major events as opportunities to create more leverage with your strategic partners. Right. And when they're able to do that, they're able to gain more access ultimately to cost savings as well.
So we ended the last conversation talking a little bit about AI. You brought that up as an example. But let's really lean into that a little bit and talk about what FSIs are doing with that emerging capability and kind of what they're looking to do with that and where you guys are helping them.
So generative AI, first of all, FSI has been doing AI for years and years, right? Decades. But it's how you define that, and then how the momentum has turned. And so generally, generative AI has been of interest, more of interest in the last year and a half. And that's sort of a snapshot, question and answer type of large language model or so forth. And we look at how the organizations can confine those types of models within the organization. So compliance and privacy, on-prem ChatGPTs essentially, right? How do we look at repositories and just get value out of those that are on-prem without leaking any data to the outside world? So that's a major challenge on generative. But FSIs are really leading into modeling and simulation and rendering. How do we do autonomous better with that type of capability? And that type of work requires 100x the compute that generative does. And so now we're creating tokens and data, and that's a whole nother dynamic from a data center perspective, right? It's creating AI factories. It's creating new power requirements within the data center. We are trying to foster that type of innovation by creating proof of concept playgrounds, if you will, where we talked to some customers. Are you crawl, walk, run? Where are you in that curve? And they said, no, I'm a infant, baby, and toddler, right? And so having a hard time justifying the budget, finding the use case, and we're really trying to help them foster that initial part of the testing by providing them an environment that's secure and safe, that they can do their innovation, bring synthetic data to, and again foster that type of innovation. So I think there's that type of work around AI that's really exciting. It's an opportunity for us to reinvest in our customers. And again, it goes back to common, repeatable, scalable. Now that they've created a concept, a use case, what is the governance around that architecture? What is that standard going to look like? And we're trying to prepare them for that as well.
And talk about that relative to lifecycle management in particular, because the ability to maybe make more use of your data that you have and that you can bring into that environment and then play with, right? And think about things like, when are these, and when are these end devices going to need some sort of upgrade?
Yeah.
And understanding that, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a huge use for it, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of gave you the data center side of the answer, but the PC side is 50% of all data is being created at the edge on those devices, and that's where it's happening. And so, again, it goes back to lifecycle management. We want to give more capabilities there, but we have to do it at the right cost. So understanding CPUs and NPUs and GPUs and maybe how we utilize those.
All the use.
All the use. But I'm also doing Windows 11 upgrades at the same time. I'm trying to do on-prem ChatGPT on those devices. So I'm adding a lot of new workloads to the device. And ultimately, we'll have new standards as a result. We call them AI PCs now, but a year from now, they'll just be PCs, right?
Well, and that compute power on the back end is a big thing that people haven't really fully addressed entirely. I mean, they're starting to realize that now as they're really beginning to play with these different models on a smaller scale.
Yeah.
In that sandbox, are you looking also at like that idea of the small language model almost, like that idea of breaking down the large language models in some cases because it just makes more sense?
So actually, no, we haven't thought of that. We see it more in terms of what is the profile or persona of that end user? What are they actually trying to accomplish? We think that more it's not about the individual, it's about a group of individuals that are trying to do something. And so how do they leverage all the assets sort of together? That's kind of interesting. Not to limit them to one certain size, but try to give them the scale that they need across multiple assets and users.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's move to cloud now for a little bit. I mean, it makes sense what we were just talking about with the compute need and also the data that becomes an issue. Talk about moving to that OpEx model.
Yeah.
I know that that's a huge piece for future tech, and that's been an area that you've been working with your clients with for a while. I mean, PC as a service is a big example of that. Yeah. But let's talk about what are the challenges that your customers have there and how you guys help them with that?
The challenges are doing that in classified environments, right? Where there's no telemetry available to say how much they're actually utilizing an asset, right? So from an on-prem perspective, that's the first challenge, and it goes back to transparency and trust and how we manage that. The second is it's a new model, and there's a lot to overcome in terms of what OpEx really means. Is it a lease or not a lease, and how do we do the accounting? But then operationalizing the chargeback for that, how we do the invoicing and so forth. So there's a lot that goes into the conversation. I think what we do really well is wrap a solution entirely around the OpEx model and not just a part of the solution. So I think Future Tech has done that really well, providing a cloud-like consumption model for on-prem assets. We're thinking hard about private marketplace, where Google Cloud and Azure and AWS are part of the overall solution. We think, our FSI customers are telling us that there's been mandates to be future ready for fences and other types of architectures. And so we have to think about that future readiness, but how you create a private marketplace for the on-prem consumption, the hyperscaler consumption, and the colo consumption, right? So we'd like to make that more of a single pane and operate all of that for our customers.
Right. Well, and that's essential for the FSIs because so many of the agencies that they work with are using all the hyperscaler, right? Their infrastructure is hyperscaler. Yeah. And they also have some things on-prem, and they're trying to make that on-prem feel more OpEx too, feel more cloud-like, act cloud-like, and interact with those hyperscalers.
Yeah, yeah. And it goes back to the technical debt conversation about agility, right? Ultimately, if I'm not paying 5 years of CapEx up front and hoping that I utilize all of that asset, now I'm paying for 50% of it. I have flexible consumption for peaks, everything that you would expect from a cloud-like consumption model. So it's been fantastic.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap, I just really want to know, what makes you passionate about this work? I mean, you seem excited about all these things you're doing, but what really gets you up in the morning and gets you going?
It's the relationship with the customer and having an impact on their mission, their business outcome. When you get to that place working with a customer where you understand their business and you're really bringing value by connecting the dots across their organization, where I can say, I just had that same conversation with someone in your organization over here, and here's what they're doing. That really brings value. And when you start to build that in aggregate in conversation, you get trust and transparency, and then ultimately, have a real business impact. Some of what we're talking about today, we did with a customer and resulted in $100 million of savings over 5 years. I mean, those are real significant dollars, especially in today's world. And it's creating sort of this virtuous loop of innovation too, going back to digital maturity, is I've got savings, I can reinvest, I foster innovation, I find more standards and more savings and so forth. And so that's really what gets me up in the morning, is not the transaction itself, but really that transformation.
I was going to come back to that innovation thing, because it seems like that's the key there, right? If you can get those savings, you can have something to then keep propelling yourself ahead for that innovation to solve problems, because clearly the FSIs are only going to become more important in the current environment.
Yeah, they're under more and more pressure from not the usual suspects, right? From new FSIs, if you will. And so being more commercially minded, being more agile, being more innovative, that's, and, different adversaries and so forth. So yeah, I think the innovation, if you start there, then you can find standards and cost savings. It's a better place to start ultimately than just trying to find savings.
Mike, I really want to thank you for joining me today. It was great and fascinating to talk to you.
Thank you.
And hear all about how Future Tech is working with FSIs to become more efficient and effective in their capabilities to support the government. And thank you, our audience, for joining us too. I'm Vanessa Roberts, and my guest today has been Mike Watkinson. He's the Chief Revenue Officer at Future Tech. To learn more about enterprise infrastructure and asset management best practices, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Future Tech. Have a great day, and see you soon on federalnewsnetwork.com.